There is something happening to you right now that you have not been given the language to understand. Not a breakdown, not confusion, not the slow erosion of something that was once stable. What is happening to you is something far more precise than any of those explanations, and far more significant than the words most people reach for when they try to describe it. The world around you has been feeling slightly off. Not dramatically wrong, not shattered, just thin, like a painting that has always hung on the wall. But today, for the first time, you can see the texture of the canvas beneath the image. Conversations that used to feel solid now feel like they are happening at a slight distance. Places that once felt permanent now carry a strange sense of impermanence, as if they are sets rather than settings. Your own thoughts seem to arrive from somewhere outside the identity that used to claim them, like transmissions from a frequency you are only now beginning to receive. Most people who experience this reach immediately for the nearest explanation: burnout, anxiety, something wrong with sleep, with diet, with circumstance. And so they treat the symptom. They try to return to the feeling of solidity. They reach back toward the familiar, toward the dense, toward the reassuringly ordinary texture of the life they knew before this strangeness began. They do everything in their power to make the feeling stop, to patch the gap in the surface, to restore the comfortable opacity of a world that does not seem to be looking back at them through its own thinning. But here is what we're going to do today. We are not going to reach back. We are going to go further in. Because what you have been calling that strange feeling, that sense of unreality, that subtle but persistent impression that the world is not quite as fixed as it once appeared, is not a malfunction. It is the veil beginning to dissolve. And beneath that veil is an architecture of reality so different from the surface version you were handed at birth, that when you see it clearly, you will not be frightened by the strangeness you have been experiencing. You will recognize it. You will understand that what felt like disorientation was actually the first tremor of a much deeper seeing, and you will never be able to look at the surface the same way again. That is what this transmission is about. Not comfort, not reassurance that everything is fine. Something more radical than that. We are going to lift the veil, layer by layer, until you can see what has always been beneath it, until the strangeness resolves, not into the old familiar solidity, but into something far more interesting. A world with depth, a reality with layers, a self with roots that go all the way down to the field from which all things emerge. Let us begin at the surface, because before we can show you what is underneath, we have to be honest about what the surface is, what it has been, what it was always pretending to be. The surface version of reality is the one you were handed before you were old enough to question it. It arrived not as a philosophy or a theory, but as a simple, self-evident given. Things are solid. The table is solid. The floor is solid. Your body is solid. The past is fixed. The future is uncertain, but navigable. You are a person moving through a world of objects, and the relationship between you and those objects is governed by laws that are consistent, measurable, and fundamentally independent of your observation of them. That is the surface, and for most of human history, that surface was enough. It allowed us to build cities and plant crops and navigate oceans and send signals through the air. The surface version of reality is not wrong exactly. It is just incomplete in a way that changes everything once you see it. It is like a map that correctly represents the roads, but leaves out the entire underground, the aquifers and the fault lines and the ancient buried structures that determine where the roads can go and what happens when the ground shifts. The map is useful. The map is accurate at the level it is drawn, but the map is not the territory, and the territory has depth that the map cannot contain. The surface version of reality required you to accept something that when you press it even slightly begins to crumble. It required you to accept that you are a passive observer of a fixed world, that the reality you experience exists independently of your observation of it, that consciousness is a byproduct of matter rather than a participant in it, that what you see is all there is, that the solid, measurable, predictable surface of things is the whole story. Because beneath that surface, something was always there that the surface could not account for, something that the surface version of reality required you to ignore, to explain away, to file under the category of the merely psychological or the merely spiritual, the merely subjective. Something that the most precise instruments ever built eventually found. Not in the realm of philosophy or mysticism, but in the literal structure of matter itself. And finding it changed physics forever. It just did not change most people's understanding of reality, because most people only heard the surface explanation of what was found. They heard the simplified version, the version that had all the strangeness quietly removed, the version that was handed to them in a textbook summary and then filed away under interesting but not personally relevant, the version that left out the part that changes everything. Today, we remove the removal. Today, we go beneath the explanation you were given. Here is what quantum mechanics actually discovered. Not the textbook summary, not the version that gets polished into a digestible metaphor and handed to the public with its most radical implications quietly edited out. The actual discovery, the raw, unpolished, still disturbing, to physicists who think about it too carefully discovery. When scientists in the early 20th century began examining the behavior of matter at its smallest scales, they expected to find the same mechanical universe that existed at the large scale, just smaller. Particles moving through space according to fixed trajectories, a clockwork universe at a tinier resolution. The same world shrunk down, the same rules applied more precisely. What they found instead was so strange that some of the greatest scientific minds of the century spent decades refusing to accept its implications. Einstein himself went to his grave, convinced that the strangeness was a sign of incompleteness in the theory, rather than a genuine feature of reality. Schrödinger, one of the architects of quantum mechanics, invented a famous thought experiment with a cat in a box, specifically to demonstrate how absurd the implications were, intending it as a reductio ad absurdum, an argument that the theory must be wrong, and yet the theory kept being confirmed, experiment after experiment, decade after decade. The strangeness was not a bug. It was the feature. What they found was that at the quantum level, matter does not behave like matter at all. It behaves like possibility. A particle, when not being observed, does not occupy a single location. It exists as a wave of probability spread across multiple possible positions simultaneously. It is not that we simply do not know where it is. It is that the question of where it is does not have a single answer until the moment of observation. The particle exists in superposition, which means it occupies all of its possible states at once until consciousness interacts with it. And then in that moment of interaction, the wave of probability collapses. One possibility becomes actual. The particle appears in a location with measurable properties. Where before there was a spread of possibility, now there is a specific actuality. Where before there was a wave, now there is a particle. Where before there was the entire range of what could be, now there is the precise singularity of what is. Let that settle for a moment before we go further, because this is the layer beneath the surface that most people hear and then immediately sand down into something more comfortable. They hear it and they think, well, that is interesting physics, but surely it does not apply to the large-scale world I live in. Surely my table is still solid. Surely my past is still fixed. Surely the reality I experience is still the independent observer, neutral thing I was always told it was. But here is what the surface explanation leaves out. The observer effect is not a quirk of subatomic scale. It is a fundamental feature of the nature of reality. The quantum field, that vast ocean of probability from which all matter emerges, does not simply generate a fixed reality that consciousness then passively witnesses. Consciousness participates in the collapse, in the selection, in the determination of which possibility becomes actual. Remove the observer and you do not have a world without a witness. You have a wave function, a spread of probability, a field of what could be, waiting for the contact with awareness that will determine what is. Amit Goswami, one of the most rigorous theoretical physicists to engage seriously with this question, described it in terms that the mainstream scientific conversation has never fully absorbed. Consciousness, he argued, is not a product of matter. It is the ground from which matter emerges. The quantum field is not a thing that exists independently of observation. It is a field of potentiality that requires consciousness to become actual. This is not mysticism dressed in scientific language. It is the logical extension of what the mathematics of quantum mechanics actually implies. Pressed past the point where most physicists feel comfortable pressing it. That is the layer beneath the surface. Not a metaphor, not a spiritual overlay on top of the science. The actual implication of what the most precise experiments in the history of human knowledge have revealed. The solid world you see is not solid at its base. It is a collapsed probability. It is the version of an infinite field of possible realities that your consciousness, entangled with the consciousness of everyone around you, has participated in selecting. The surface is real, but it is not fundamental. It is the thinnest, outermost expression of something that has depth, beyond anything the surface version of reality can contain. If this transmission is already reaching something in you, take a second to like this video and subscribe so we can keep going deeper together. Now let us keep going. Now let us go one layer deeper, because the quantum field is not the bottom. There is something beneath even that. When physicists describe the quantum field, they describe it in mathematical language, wave functions, probability amplitudes, operators, and eigenstates. The mathematics is extraordinarily precise. It predicts experimental outcomes with an accuracy that has never been matched by any other scientific framework in history. The predictions are so exact, so consistently confirmed, that quantum mechanics is considered the most empirically successful theory ever constructed by human minds. Its track record is essentially perfect, but mathematics describes the behavior of the field. It does not tell you what the field is, and this is where something remarkable begins to emerge. Because when you ask what the quantum field actually is, when you press beneath the mathematics to the underlying nature of what is being described, you find yourself in territory that physics has not yet fully mapped. You find yourself at the edge of the known, looking into something that the instruments of science can measure the effects of, but cannot yet fully characterize. The equations work, the predictions hold, but the ontology, the question of what kind of thing this actually is, remains genuinely open. And the answers that serious physicists have proposed, when pressed on this question, are far stranger than the public summary of quantum mechanics ever suggests. What the quantum field appears to be, at its most fundamental level, is something like pure potentiality, not matter, not energy in the conventional sense, not space or time as ordinarily understood. Something prior to all of those, something from which all of those emerge as expressions, as collapsed possibilities, as the thin surface of something with no bottom. Some physicists describe it as information. Some describe it as a kind of cosmic computation. Some, following the implications of the mathematics, as far as they will go, describe it in terms that are nearly indistinguishable from what the ancient contemplative traditions described as the ground of being. And here is where the veil lifts, in a way that should stop you completely. Because this description, this account of a field of infinite potentiality that underlies the visible world and from which all manifest reality emerges through a process of collapse or selection, is not new. It was not discovered in the 20th century. It was mapped in precise and extraordinarily sophisticated terms by wisdom traditions that existed thousands of years before any of the instruments that confirmed it were built. These traditions did not have particle accelerators, they did not have electron microscopes or interferometers, or the mathematics of Hilbert space. What they had was something else, something that turned out to be, in its own way, just as precise, just as capable of reaching the depth beneath the surface. The Vedantic tradition of ancient India described what it called Brahman, the infinite ground of being from which all manifest reality arises, not as a deity in the conventional sense, as a field, as the underlying substrate of existence itself, undifferentiated, infinite, and prior to all distinction. The visible world, what the Vedantic tradition called Maya, was understood not as illusion in the sense of being false, but as a surface, a thin expression of the infinite ground that underlies it, a collapsed form of something that, in its deepest nature, has no fixed form at all. The word Maya does not mean fake. It means measured. It means the version of the infinite that has been given form and boundary and apparent solidity, the surface stretched over the depth. The ancient Chinese philosophical tradition described the Tao, the underlying way or ground of reality, in terms that carry a striking resonance with the quantum field. The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. The ground of reality in this framework is prior to any particular form. It is the infinite potentiality from which the 10,000 things, all of manifest existence, emerge. And the sage, in the Taoist tradition, is not someone who has acquired more knowledge of the surface. It is someone who has learned to act from alignment with the depth, who has learned to let the field move through them, rather than imposing the narrow pattern of conditioned identity upon it. The Hermetic tradition of ancient Egypt and Greece, which formed one of the deep roots of Western esoteric thought, described a principle it called the All, the infinite mind from which all reality is projected as a kind of mental emanation. The visible world in this framework was understood as a thought within a cosmic consciousness, a surface expression of a deeper mental reality. The Kabbalion, which preserves the core of this teaching, states it with a directness that is startling when you read it against the background of quantum field theory. The universe is mental, all is mind. The visible world is a projection within consciousness, not a thing that consciousness happens to observe from outside. These traditions were not guessing. They were not constructing comforting myths to explain what they did not understand. They were not doing what we often assume ancient wisdom traditions were doing, which is projecting human fears and hopes onto a cosmos they could not yet measure. They were mapping something they had accessed through a different kind of instrument than the particle accelerator or the electron microscope. They were mapping what they found when consciousness turned its attention inward, past the surface of thought, past the surface of sensation, past the surface of individual identity, and encountered the field that underlies all of it. And what they found, described in the language of their time and their tradition, is structurally identical to what quantum physics found when it turned its instruments toward the smallest scales of matter, a field of infinite potentiality, a ground from which all manifest reality emerges, a depth beneath the surface of the visible world that changes everything about what the surface is. The mystics mapped it first, the physicists confirmed it later, and most people are still living as if neither thing happened, still moving through the surface as if it is all there is, still treating the thin outermost layer of an infinitely deep reality as the whole story. That is the layer beneath the surface that most people never reach, not because it is hidden from them, because they were never shown where to look, and because the looking requires a different kind of attention than the surface demands. The surface rewards outward focus. The depth rewards inward precision, and most of the systems that shape ordinary life are designed to keep attention moving outward across the surface, never pausing long enough to notice the depth beneath it. But there is a layer beneath even that. Let us keep going. Here is something that the quantum mechanics and the ancient traditions converge on in a way that has implications for your life right now, in the way you are experiencing reality at this very moment. If the quantum field is a field of infinite potentiality, and if consciousness participates in collapsing that field into specific actualities, then the version of reality you are experiencing is not simply happening to you. It is, in some profound, immeasurable sense, being selected by you, not by your conscious preferences or your deliberate choices, though those matter, by something deeper, by the coherence pattern of your consciousness itself, by the identity structure that determines which possibilities your awareness consistently selects from the infinite field. Think about what this means. Your identity is not just a psychological phenomenon, it is a quantum mechanical one. The pattern of who you take yourself to be, the neural architecture of your personality, the emotional loops that define your characteristic way of relating to experience. All of this functions as a kind of lens through which consciousness interacts with the quantum field, and that lens determines which probabilities collapse into your reality, not occasionally, not in special circumstances, continuously, in every moment. Every perception you have, every experience that solidifies into the apparent fact of your life is a collapsed probability, and the collapse is shaped by the lens. Joe Dispenza, who has spent decades studying the neuroscience of transformation and its relationship to consciousness and the quantum field, describes it in terms that cut directly to this layer. Personality creates personal reality, not because of some vague law of attraction metaphor, because of the specific, measurable way that neural patterns and emotional states determine how consciousness interacts with the field of probability. The brain is constantly projecting forward, using the past to predict the future, and when those predictions are stable, they reinforce the same collapsed reality over and over again. The same neural patterns fire, the same emotional states arise, the same probabilities collapse. the same reality appears, and the whole system confirms itself moment by moment in a loop that feels like simply the way things are. Which means that when your identity begins to change, when the neural architecture of your personality begins to reorganize, the pattern of probabilities that your consciousness collapses begins to change as well. The reality that was being reinforced by the old identity begins to lose stability. The collapsed version of the world that matched who you used to be begins to feel slightly unreal, slightly temporary, slightly thin, and that is exactly what you have been experiencing. That strange feeling is not confusion. It is not malfunction. It is the quantum mechanical signature of a consciousness that is detaching from one identity structure and beginning to reorganize around another. It is what happens when the lens through which you have been collapsing reality begins to change shape. The old reality does not disappear all at once. It begins to feel like what it always was, a surface, a thin expression of a field that contains infinite other possibilities. And that feeling, that thinness, that slight unreality, is not a sign that something is going wrong. It is a sign that the lens is loosening, that the groove is filling in, that the field is beginning to have more freedom than the old pattern allowed. And in the space between the old lens and the new one, in that strange, slightly unreal, slightly expanded moment of transition, the field has more freedom than it usually does. The old probabilities are no longer being reinforced with the same intensity, and new ones are beginning to become possible, not as wishes, not as intentions, as genuine openings in the structure of what can collapse from the field into the actuality of your experience. This is where the veil is thinnest, right here in the strangeness you have been trying to explain away. I want to pause here and ask you something. Has there been a moment in your own life where a layer suddenly became visible that you had been walking on top of without knowing it was there? A truth that was hiding in plain sight until you were finally ready to see it. Drop it in the comments. What you found beneath the surface matters, and it adds to the depth of what everyone watching this is building together. Let me show you something now through a story, because sometimes the deepest layers of truth reveal themselves most clearly through the particular, through the lived, through the human. The abstract can describe the depth, but the story can take you there. There was a woman named Seren who lived in a city built on a cliff above the sea. The city was old, layered over centuries of habitation, and Seren had lived there all her life. She knew every street, every building, every view from every angle. She knew the city the way you know a face you have looked at every day for years. She did not look at it anymore. She moved through it. The familiarity had become invisibility. The surface had become so known that it had stopped being seen. Then one morning, after a storm that had lasted 3 days, she walked out of her apartment and found that a section of the street near the harbor had collapsed. Not catastrophically, just enough that a gap had opened in the cobblestones, and through that gap Seren could see something she had never seen before. Stone. Old stone, older than the cobblestones by centuries. the foundations of a different city buried beneath the one she knew. Smooth-fitted, dark with age, arranged with a precision that the current street did not have. She stood there for a long time looking at that gap in the surface, and something happened to her perception that she could not fully explain. She began to see the city differently, not just the gap, the whole city, because now she knew that beneath the surface she had always moved through, there was another layer, and beneath that, almost certainly, another. The city she had known all her life was still there, still real, still functional, but it was no longer the whole story. It was the thinnest, outermost expression of something with depth she had never suspected. The surface had not changed, but her relationship to it had changed completely. She was no longer standing on solid ground. She was standing on the latest layer of something with a history that went all the way down. She spent the next several weeks researching the layers. She found that the city had been built and rebuilt over more than 2,000 years, that beneath the current streets lay the ruins of at least 4 previous cities, each one buried by time and circumstance, each one leaving its structure in the earth as a kind of record. The second layer was a medieval settlement whose stones had been cannibalized for the buildings above it. The third was a Roman outpost, its grid still faintly visible in the angles of the modern streets above it. The fourth was something older still, pre-Roman, its identity uncertain, its purpose unknown. The deepest layer, the archaeologist told her, was a settlement so old that its builders were unknown. No written record, no artifacts that could be attributed to a known culture, just stone, arranged with a precision that suggested something had been understood there, something about geometry or about the relationship between built structure and the landscape that had been lost in every subsequent layer. Whoever they were, they had known something, and that knowing was now buried so deep that even the people who spent their lives studying the layers could only gesture at what it might have been. Seren could not stop thinking about that deepest layer, not because of what it contained, because of what it changed about everything above it. Every layer she had ever walked on had been built on the ruins of something older. Every surface had been a surface stretched over something deeper. The city she had known, the one she had stopped looking at because she assumed she already knew it, had been hiding an archaeology of itself that changed the meaning of every layer she had ever touched. She walked the streets differently after that, not because the streets had changed, because she had. She was no longer moving through a surface. She was moving through the outermost layer of something with infinite depth. Every cobblestone was a lid. Every building was a surface expression of a history that went further down than she could see. The city was the same. Her perception of it had been permanently altered. She carried the knowledge of the depth now, and that knowledge changed what the surface was. And you've been walking through a city built on ruins you were never shown. Today, the gap has opened, and you are looking down through it for the first time. The surface is still there. It is still real, but it is no longer all there is. And once you have seen the depth, you cannot unsee it. Now let us go to the layer that most people find the most disorienting. The layer that, once seen, makes the strange feeling you have been experiencing not just understandable, but inevitable. Your identity is not what you think it is, not in the way the surface version of selfhood presents it. The surface version says you are a continuous, stable entity moving through time, a person with a fixed set of characteristics, a consistent personality, a reliable narrative about who you are and what your life means. The surface version says that identity is the thing that stays the same while circumstances change around it. The anchor, the constant, the ground from which you navigate the variable world. But beneath that surface, neuroscience has found something that should have changed everything about how we understand the self. It just mostly did not, because most people heard the surface explanation of the finding and stopped there. They heard neurons fire together, wire together, and nodded and moved on. They did not press beneath it to the implication that changes everything about what the self is. Here is what is actually beneath the surface of identity. Your personality is not a fixed structure. It is a dynamic pattern. It is a network of neural connections that have been reinforced over time by repeated emotional responses to repeated experiences. Every time you react to a situation in the same way, every time you tell yourself the same story about who you are, every time you feel the same familiar emotional response to the same familiar trigger, you are not expressing a fixed self. You are strengthening a pattern. You are deepening a groove in the neural architecture of your brain. The self that feels so solid, so continuous, so obviously real is a habit, a deeply reinforced, constantly self-confirming habit, a groove that has been cut so deep that it feels like bedrock. But it is not bedrock, it is pattern, and patterns can change. And that pattern, that groove, is what your consciousness uses to interact with the quantum field. It is the lens through which you collapse probability into experience. It is the identity structure that selects from the infinite field of what is possible the specific version of reality you inhabit. The groove determines the channel determines what flows, and what flows determines what you experience as the solid, given, inevitable facts of your life. Which means that when that pattern begins to change, when the groove begins to fill in, and a new one begins to form, the version of reality your consciousness has been selecting begins to change as well. The old reality does not immediately disappear, but it begins to feel different. It begins to feel like what it is, a collapsed probability, one version of an infinite field, a surface. And the feeling of that shift, the felt sense of the old reality losing its solidity, is not pathology, it is physics. And this is precisely what is happening in the experience you have been trying to explain. The neural patterns that maintained your previous identity are weakening. The emotional loops that reinforced the old version of who you are losing their automatic authority. The inner voice that used to narrate your identity with complete conviction has begun to sound like a recording rather than a truth, a voice from a room you are no longer quite in. This is not a crisis. This is the architecture of transformation at the level where it actually happens. Not in circumstances, not in events, in the neural substrate of identity itself, in the quantum mechanical lens through which your consciousness has been selecting reality. And the most important thing to understand about this phase, the thing that most people are never told, and that causes them to reverse the very transformation that is trying to occur, is this. The strangeness is not a malfunction. The sense of unreality is not a symptom to be treated. The feeling of being between identities, of being neither fully the person you were, nor fully the person you are becoming, is the doorway. It is the space between lenses. And in that space, the quantum field is freer than it has ever been. The old probabilities are no longer being reinforced with their usual intensity. The new ones are not yet fully stabilized, and in that gap, in that beautiful, disorienting, luminous gap, the field reorganizes. New possibilities become accessible that the old lens could not have selected. New realities begin to press toward collapse. The field is not waiting for you to decide what to do next. It is already moving, already reorganizing around the new coherence that is beginning to form beneath the dissolution of the old one. Most people slam the door shut at this point. They feel the strangeness, and they reach for the familiar. They recreate the old emotional patterns, the old stories, the old reactions, because those patterns feel like stability. They feel like ground. They feel like self. And the moment they do, the old identity restabilizes. The old lens reforms. The old probabilities collapse back into the old reality. And the doorway closes. Not permanently. The field always offers another opening, but the moment passes, and the cost of closing the door is not just the loss of what might have been. It is the reinforcement of the pattern that will make the next opening harder to stay in. But you are here, which means something in you has not closed the door. Something in you has remained in the strangeness long enough to ask what it actually is. And that question, that willingness to stay in the gap rather than flee back to the surface, is itself a quantum event. It is consciousness choosing not to reinforce the old collapse. It is the beginning of a new pattern. It is the first deliberate act of a self that is becoming something the old self could not have been. Let us go deeper now into the ancient layer, because the wisdom traditions did not just map the quantum field in abstract terms. They map the specific experience of identity dissolution and timeline transition with a precision that is, once you see it, breathtaking. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition has a concept it calls the bardo. The bardo is typically described as the intermediate state between death and rebirth, the transitional space where consciousness finds itself after one life has ended and before another has begun. But the Tibetan masters were clear that the bardo is not only a post-mortem experience, it is a structure of consciousness that can be entered in life. That is, in fact, entered every night in deep sleep, that is entered in deep meditation, and that is entered in moments of profound transformation when one identity structure dissolves and another has not yet formed. The bardo is not a place, it is a state, and it is a state that living people enter whenever the ordinary structure of selfhood becomes sufficiently permeable. The Bardo teachings describe the experience of this transitional state with remarkable precision. They describe a sense of unreality, of groundlessness, of familiar structures losing their solidity. They describe thoughts and emotions arising and dissolving without the usual sense of a stable self to claim them. They describe a kind of luminous openness, a quality of awareness that is less filtered, less structured, less confined to the narrow channel of ordinary identity. And they describe the tendency in this state to experience something that the tradition calls the clear light, a direct encounter with the ground of awareness itself, unmediated by the structures of the ordinary self. And they describe very specifically the tendency of consciousness in this state to reach back toward the familiar, to try to recreate the structures that have dissolved, to mistake groundlessness for danger, and to flee back toward the old patterns, the old identity, the old collapsed reality, because those patterns feel like self, because the nervous system, trained over a lifetime to equate structure with safety, interprets the dissolution of structure as threat, and it responds the way it always responds to threat, by contracting, by reaching for the known, by rebuilding the walls. The Bardo teachings are, in their deepest layer, a guide to not doing that. They are instructions for how to remain in the transitional space long enough for a genuinely new pattern to emerge, for consciousness to stabilize in a new configuration, rather than collapsing back into the old one. They are, in the language of quantum mechanics, instructions for how to remain in superposition long enough for a genuinely new probability to collapse rather than defaulting under the pressure of discomfort to the same probability that has always collapsed before. And what they describe as the key to navigating this space is recognition. Not effort, not will, not the forcing of a new identity into place. Recognition. The recognition that the groundlessness is not danger, that the dissolution is not destruction, that what feels like the loss of self is actually the liberation of awareness from a particular pattern of self, and that in that liberated awareness, something is possible that was not possible when the old pattern was firmly in place. The Sufi tradition maps the same territory in a different language. The concept of fana, often translated as annihilation, describes the dissolution of the individual self in the infinite ground of being. Not as a permanent death of the personality, but as a temporary dissolution of the boundary between the individual lens and the infinite field it is looking through. And in that dissolution, in that moment of fana, the mystic encounters what the Sufi masters called the baka, the subsistence or continuation in a new configuration, a self that has passed through dissolution and emerged reorganized around a deeper ground. Not the same self with different content, a fundamentally different relationship between self and the field from which self emerges. The experience these traditions describe is not metaphorical. It is not a poetic description of an emotional state. It is a precise map of what happens to consciousness when identity restructures at a fundamental level, when the quantum lens changes shape, when the pattern of collapsed reality begins to reorganize. These traditions were cartographers of interior space, and the territory they mapped is the same territory you are moving through right now. And the map they offer is this: do not flee the dissolution. Recognize it. Allow it. Understand that what is dissolving was never the deepest layer of what you are. It was a surface, a pattern, a lens, and beneath it, something is waiting that has more depth than any pattern could contain. Now let us do something. Let us make this experiential, because understanding at the conceptual level is the surface of understanding. The depth of it is felt. The depth of it lives in the body, in the direct perception, in the quality of attention that can hold both the surface and what is beneath it at once. I want you to do something very simple. I want you to look at your hands, not to analyze them, not to think about them, just to look at them, the surface of them, the skin, the lines, the particular way they rest or move, the familiar topography of something you have seen thousands of times without really seeing. Now hold that looking, and while you are holding it, bring to mind the fact that what you are seeing is not what is there at the deepest level. What you are seeing is the collapsed expression of a quantum field of probability. The apparent solidity of the skin and bone and blood is a surface. Beneath it, at the atomic level, there is mostly space. Electrons orbiting nuclei with vast distances between them relative to their size. If an atom were the size of a cathedral, the nucleus would be smaller than a grain of sand at its center, and the electrons would be somewhere near the outer walls with nothing but empty space between them. The solid surface of your hand is, at the atomic level, almost entirely empty, and those electrons, at the quantum level, are not even particles in the ordinary sense. They are waves of probability collapsed into apparent solidity by the act of observation, by the coherence of consciousness interacting with the field. The solidity you see is real at the scale at which you are observing it, but it is not fundamental. It is the surface expression of something that, at its deepest level, is mostly space organized by probability into the appearance of matter. Your hands are, at their deepest level, mostly space organized by probability into the appearance of solidity. The solid surface is real, but it is not fundamental. It is the thinnest, outermost expression of something with infinite depth. Feel what shifts when you hold that, not as a thought, as a direct perception. The hands are still there, still real, still yours, but they are no longer just solid objects. They are surfaces, membranes, the outermost layer of something that extends all the way down to the quantum field and all the way up to the consciousness that is observing them. The hand and the awareness of the hand are not two separate things with a gap between them. They are two expressions of the same field meeting at the surface of perception. Now bring that same quality of perception to the feeling you have been carrying. That sense of unreality, that strangeness, that impression that the world is slightly thinner than it used to be? What if that feeling is not a malfunction in your perception? What if it is a more accurate perception? What if the world has not become thinner? What if you have simply become capable of seeing the thinness that was always there? What if the veil is not dissolving because something is wrong, but because something is right, because your awareness has reached a depth from which the surface can be seen for what it is? The feeling you have been trying to explain away is your perception updating. Your consciousness is seeing the surface as a surface for the first time, and that is not disorientation. That is the beginning of depth vision. Let us go to the next layer, because there is something beneath the quantum mechanics and the ancient wisdom that is more personal, more immediate, more directly relevant to the life you are living right now. When identity begins to restructure, there is a specific sequence of experiences that occurs, and most people, because they have never been given a map of this sequence, interpret each stage as a problem to be solved, rather than a layer to be moved through. They reach for solutions when what is needed is recognition. They try to fix what is not broken. They try to restore what was never meant to be permanent. The first stage is what we might call the quieting of the automatic voice, the inner narrator, the one that has been running a continuous commentary on your life, telling you who you are and what everything means and what is possible and what is not, begins to lose its authority. Its volume does not necessarily decrease, but its convincingness does. The thoughts are still there, but they have begun to feel like recordings rather than truths, like a radio playing in another room rather than a voice speaking from the center of your being. You can hear it, but you are no longer entirely inside it. This is not emptiness. This is the first sign of something becoming available that was not available before, because that automatic voice, that relentless narrator, was the primary mechanism by which the old identity reinforced itself. Every thought it generated was a vote for the old pattern. Every story it told about who you are was a signal to the quantum field to keep collapsing the same probabilities. And when it begins to lose its authority, those votes stop being cast with the same automatic certainty. The old pattern begins to weaken. The field begins to open. A gap appears between the thought and the belief in the thought, and in that gap, something new becomes possible. The second stage is what we might call the neutralizing of emotional triggers. Situations that used to generate an immediate, automatic emotional response begin to feel strangely neutral. Things that would have provoked anxiety or urgency or reactivity now seem to pass through awareness without catching. This can feel like numbness, and it is important to understand why it is not. Numbness is the absence of feeling. What this is the presence of a different quality of feeling. A feeling that is less automatic, less conditioned, less filtered through the survival-based predictions of the old identity. It is not that you are feeling less. It is that you are feeling from a different layer, from a place that is slightly further back from the surface, from a depth that the old automatic reactions could not reach. The third stage is the one that most people find the most disorienting, and the one that is actually the most significant. It is the experience of time becoming strange. Days seem to accelerate, and yet certain moments feel expanded, almost crystalline in their clarity. There is a sense that the ordinary texture of time has become slightly different, slightly more fluid, slightly less like a fixed track and more like a field that is organizing itself around something. Moments arrive with a quality of significance that ordinary time does not carry. The present becomes more present than it used to be, and the past, which used to feel like a fixed record, begins to feel more like one version of what happened, one collapsed probability among others that were possible. This is not a psychological distortion. It is what happens when the neural patterns that create the ordinary experience of time, the patterns that project the past forward into the future with mechanical regularity, begin to loosen. The brain's predictive machinery is one of the primary mechanisms by which time feels fixed and linear. When that machinery begins to recalibrate, the experience of time recalibrates with it. The fixed track becomes a field. The inevitable sequence becomes a range of possibility, and the present moment, which the old identity moved through quickly on its way to the predicted future, becomes the place where the field is most alive, most open, most available. And then the fourth stage, synchronicities, the small, precise, impossible to fully explain moments where the world seems to respond to something happening inside you, where the right information appears at the right moment, where connections reveal themselves that were invisible before, where the field seems to be communicating in a language that is below the threshold of ordinary logic, but above the threshold of coincidence. The book falls open to the exact passage. The conversation takes an unexpected turn that addresses something you were carrying in silence. The image, the phrase, the encounter arrives with a precision that feels like it was placed there by something that knew what you needed before you did. These are not random. They are not wishful thinking. They are the result of something very specific happening in the nervous system. When the brain is less dominated by stress-based prediction, when it is operating from a more coherent, more receptive state, it begins to detect patterns that were always present but previously filtered out. The reticular activating system, which determines what the brain pays attention to and what it screens out, is calibrated by the emotional and identity state of the organism. When that state changes, the calibration changes, and what seemed like coincidence begins to reveal itself as signal, as the field communicating through the only language it has. Pattern, resonance, the precise arrival of what is needed at the moment it becomes possible to receive it. Think about your own experience of this sequence right now. Has there been a pattern in your life that held complete authority over you until the moment you looked at it directly and then dissolved? Something that was running beneath the surface of your choices and your reactions, invisible until it suddenly was not. Tell me in the comments. Because the patterns that lose their power when they are finally seen are one of the most precise signs that the veil is thinning, and naming what you found beneath the surface helps others find their way to the same layer. there is another layer beneath this, a layer that connects everything we have been exploring into something that is not just intellectually coherent, but personally transformative. Here is what the quantum field, the ancient traditions, and the neuroscience of identity transformation all converge on when you press beneath their surface explanations. The deepest layer of what you are is not your personality. It is not your story. It is not your history or your characteristics or your preferences or your fears. The deepest layer of what you are is the observer, the consciousness that is aware of all of those things, the awareness that watches the thoughts without being the thoughts, that feels the emotions without being defined by them, that perceives the identity without being exhausted by it. The thing that is reading these words right now and is aware that it is reading them, this is not a new idea, but it is an idea that most people encounter at the surface level and never press beneath. They hear it as a spiritual teaching, a comforting thought, a nice concept. They nod at it and move on, back to the surface, back to the identity, back to the automatic narrator who was waiting for them to return. But it is not a concept. It is the most empirically supported fact about the nature of consciousness that exists. And when you press beneath the concept to the direct experience of it, everything changes. Because here is what quantum mechanics found when it pressed beneath the surface of matter. Beneath every particle, beneath every apparently solid object, beneath every measurable thing, there is a field that is not a thing, a field that is pure potentiality, a field that has no fixed form until consciousness interacts with it. And what the deepest layer of the ancient traditions discovered when they pressed beneath the surface of individual identity is the same thing. Beneath every thought, beneath every emotion, beneath every story about who you are, there is awareness itself, pure, undivided, not a thing, not a person, not a fixed identity. The field of consciousness from which all experience arises and into which all experience dissolves. The awareness that was there before the first thought of the day and remains after the last one. The space in which the entire drama of identity plays out without being changed by it. The quantum field and the field of pure awareness are not analogous. They are, in the deepest layer of what we can understand, the same thing approached from two different directions. Physics approached from the outside, pressing inward through matter until it found the field. The contemplative traditions approached from the inside, pressing inward through consciousness until they found the same field. And they met in the middle. Two paths of inquiry, separated by millennia and by radically different methods, arriving at the same recognition. The ground of matter and the ground of consciousness are not separate territories. They are the same territory, the same infinite field of potentiality, the same depth beneath the surface of everything. And you, right now in this moment of transition, in this experience of the world, feeling slightly unreal and slightly thin, and slightly more permeable than it used to be. You are closer to that field than you have ever been. Because the layers of identity and assumption and automatic pattern that usually stand between you and that direct experience are thinning, the veil is dissolving. Not because something is going wrong, because something is going right, because your awareness is ready to see what has always been beneath it. Let me tell you about a man named Theo. He was a mathematician, precise by nature and by training. He had spent his career working with abstract structures, with the deep patterns that underlie the behavior of complex systems. He was comfortable with abstraction in a way that most people are not. He could hold a concept in his mind and turn it over and examine it from every angle without needing to reduce it to something concrete. He lived, professionally and personally, at the surface of a very sophisticated understanding. He knew the surface of his field better than almost anyone alive. But there was one thing that Theo could not do. He could not feel the mathematics. He could understand it. He could work with it at extraordinary levels of sophistication, but it remained for him entirely external. A tool, a language, a surface. The equations described something, but the something they described remained, for him, always on the other side of the description, always mediated, always at one remove from direct contact. Then one night, after weeks of working on a problem that had resisted every approach he had tried, something shifted. He was sitting at his desk, not working, just sitting in a state of exhaustion and quiet that he rarely allowed himself. The usual noise of his thinking had settled. The familiar narrator had gone quiet, and in that unusual stillness, something happened that he spent years afterward trying to describe accurately, always feeling that the description fell short of what had actually occurred. The mathematics stopped being a language he was using and became something he was inside. The abstract structures he had been manipulating became, for a moment that lasted, he could not say how long, something he was perceiving directly, not thinking about, perceiving, not from outside as an observer examining a system, from inside as a field recognizing its own structure. The patterns were not in the equations on the paper. They were in the structure of his own awareness. The mathematics and the mind were, in that moment, not separate things. They were the same field, looking at itself from two different angles. He solved the problem the next morning, but that was not what stayed with him. What stayed with him was the recognition, the direct, non-conceptual recognition that the patterns he had been studying outside himself were patterns that were inside him as well, that the structures of mathematics were not inventions of human thought. They were discoveries, recoveries. The mind finding in the external world the structures that were already present in the field of consciousness, from which both the mind and the world emerge. He spent the rest of his career at the intersection of mathematics and consciousness studies, not because he abandoned his scientific rigor, because he found in that moment of direct perception a layer beneath the surface of mathematics that changed everything about what mathematics was. The equations were the surface. What they described was the depth, and the depth was not out there in the external world. It was the field itself, the same field that the quantum physicists were finding beneath matter, the same field that the contemplatives were finding beneath thought, the same field that is finding you right now through the thin place in the veil that the strangeness of your experience has opened. We are approaching the deepest layer now, the one that changes not just how you understand reality, but how you inhabit it. Here is what the quantum field, the ancient traditions, the neuroscience, and the direct experience of people like Theo all point toward when you press beneath every surface explanation they offer. Reality is not something that happens to you, it is something that happens through you. The world you experience is not an independent, fixed structure that your consciousness passively witnesses. It is a collaborative creation, a continuous collapse of infinite possibility into specific actuality, shaped by the coherence pattern of the consciousness that is observing it. You are not a spectator in a theater that would exist whether you were watching or not. You are a participant in a field that requires your participation to become the specific actuality you call your life, and the consciousness that is observing it is not the personality, not the story, not the automatic patterns of the old identity. The consciousness that is observing it is the awareness beneath all of that, the pure, undivided, field-like awareness that was there before the personality formed and will be there after it dissolves. The observer that is not a thing but is the capacity from which all things are perceived, the space in which the entire drama of identity, circumstance and experience plays out without being confined to any particular version of it. When you operate from the surface layer of identity, when you are fully identified with the personality and the story and the automatic patterns, your consciousness collapses a relatively narrow band of the field's infinite possibilities. The lens is fixed. The groove is deep. The same probabilities collapse into the same experiences with mechanical regularity, and the world feels solid and fixed and limited, because the lens through which you are collapsing, it is solid and fixed and limited. The surface confirms itself. The groove deepens. The field is vast, but the channel is narrow, and only what fits through the channel becomes real. But when the identity begins to dissolve, when the lens begins to change shape, when the automatic patterns lose their authority and the field of awareness beneath them becomes more directly accessible, something changes in the way consciousness interacts with the field. The range of probabilities that can collapse widens. The selection is no longer made by the narrow, conditioned, survival-based predictions of the old personality. It begins to be made by something deeper, by the coherence of awareness itself, operating from a level that is closer to the field, and therefore capable of selecting from a broader range of what the field contains. The channel widens, the surface becomes more permeable, and what becomes real begins to reflect not the old groove, but the depth beneath it. This is what the ancient traditions meant when they described enlightenment or liberation or awakening. Not as the acquisition of something new, but as the recognition of something that was always already present. The awareness beneath the personality was never absent. The field was never not there. The depth was always beneath the surface. The veil was always thinner than it appeared. What changes in awakening is not the acquisition of a new self. It is the recognition of what was always beneath the old one. The awareness that was always there, looking through the lens of personality without being the lens, the field that was always the ground of the reality you were experiencing without being confined to any particular version of it. And from that recognition, from that direct contact with the layer beneath the surface of identity, reality begins to be selected differently, not because you are effortfully trying to create a different reality, because the consciousness that is doing the selecting has widened, because the lens has dissolved enough to allow the field to be accessed more directly, because the veil between you and the depth of what is possible has become thinner. The effort falls away. The striving relaxes. And in that relaxation, in that openness, the field moves with a freedom it could not have had when the old pattern was firmly in place. This is what is happening to you. Not a breakdown, not a malfunction, not confusion or burnout or instability. A thinning of the veil, a widening of the lens, a loosening of the old patterns that were selecting a narrow band of what is possible, and the beginning of a contact with the field that is broader, deeper, and more aligned with what the awareness beneath your personality has always known was there. There is one more layer, the practical one. The one that lives in the body rather than the concept. Because everything we have explored in this transmission exists at the level of understanding until it is embodied, until it is felt, until it changes not just what you think, but how you are. And the body is where that change happens or does not happen. The body is not a container for consciousness, it is an expression of the field. And the state of the body is one of the most direct and immediate ways that the quality of the collapse is shaped. Here is what the neuroscience tells us about the body's role in this transition. The nervous system is not just a receiver of experience, it is a generator of it. The emotional state of the body is one of the primary signals that the brain uses to predict the future. When the body is in a state of stress, of contraction, of survival level activation, the brain generates predictions that match that state. It projects a future that is consistent with the emotional reality of the present moment, a future that is threatening, uncertain, requiring constant vigilance. And those predictions, those forward projections of the stressed and contracted nervous system, are part of the mechanism by which consciousness collapses the same narrow band of probabilities over and over again. The body is not separate from the quantum field. It is one of the primary interfaces through which the field is accessed, and the state of that interface determines the quality of the access. When the body begins to shift out of that state, when the nervous system begins to regulate itself, when the emotional charge that has been reinforcing the old identity begins to settle, something opens in the brain's predictive machinery. The projections become less rigid. The future becomes less fixed by the past. The range of what can be collapsed from the field widens. The The body is not just experiencing the change, it is participating in generating it. And this is not metaphorical. The research on heart-brain coherence, on the relationship between emotional regulation and perceptual expansion, on the measurable changes in brainwave activity that accompany states of deep stillness and openness, all of this points to the same thing. When the body moves from stress coherence to open coherence, when the nervous system shifts from survival prediction to receptive presence, the interface with the field changes. The channel widens. The range of what can collapse into actuality expands. The body is not just a vehicle, it is an instrument. And the tuning of that instrument determines what frequencies of the field can be received. So here is what I want to offer you as a practice. Not a technique, not a method, a simple, direct invitation to embody what we have been exploring, to move the understanding from the surface of the mind into the depth of the body, where it can actually change the quality of the collapse. Find a moment of stillness, not forced stillness, not the effortful suppression of thought or feeling, just a moment of allowing, of not reaching for the familiar, of not trying to re-establish the old sense of normal, a moment of remaining in the gap between the old identity and the new one without fleeing it, a moment of letting the strangeness be strange without trying to resolve it back into something known. And in that moment, bring awareness to the body. Not to analyze it, not to fix anything, just to feel it. The weight of it, the warmth of it, the breath moving through it without your instruction, the simple fact of being embodied in this moment, in this body, in this particular configuration of the quantum field that has collapsed into the appearance of a person sitting here reading or listening to these words. The body is here. It is real. It is the outermost expression of the field in this particular location at this particular moment. And then, holding that awareness of the body, bring to mind the layer beneath it, the atoms that are mostly space, the electrons that are waves of probability, the quantum field that is the actual ground of what the body is. Not as a thought, as a direct perception, as a felt sense of the depth beneath the surface. The body is real, and it is also a surface. The outermost expression of something that extends all the way down to the field of infinite potentiality, the solid and the spacious at once, the particular and the infinite in the same moment. Feel what happens when you hold both of those things at once, the reality of the body and the depth beneath it, the solidity of the surface and the field that is its ground, the particular person that you are, and the awareness that is looking through that person at this very moment, the collapsed probability and the infinite field from which it emerged. That feeling, that quality of expanded, embodied awareness that includes both the surface and the depth, is not a meditation technique. It is the natural state of consciousness, when the veil between the surface and the depth becomes thin enough to see through. It is what you are moving toward. It is, in fact, what you are already beginning to experience, though you have been calling it by other names. The strangeness is this. The unreality is this. The sense that the world is thinner than it used to be is this. The veil dissolving, the depth becoming visible, the field beginning to be felt beneath the surface of everything. And once you feel it, once you have this direct, embodied sense of the depth beneath the surface, something changes in how you move through the world. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that a person who has seen beneath the surface of a city can never again walk through it, as if the surface is all there is. You carry the knowledge of the depth, and that knowledge changes the selection, changes the collapse, changes the reality that emerges from the field through the lens of your awareness. Not because you are trying to change it, because the lens through which it is being selected has changed. Because you are no longer looking only from the surface, you are looking from the depth, and from the depth, the surface looks different, more real, more precisely what it is, the outermost expression of something infinite. This is the integration, not a conclusion, not an endpoint, a new beginning, a new surface from which the next layer can be explored. Because here is the thing about depth, it does not end. Every layer you lift reveals another layer beneath it. Every veil that dissolves reveals a new depth that was hidden behind it. The field has no bottom. The awareness that perceives it has no ceiling. The process of going deeper is not a journey toward a final destination. It is the journey itself, the continuous, recursive, endlessly unfolding process of consciousness discovering what it is made of. And each discovery changes the quality of the consciousness that is doing the discovering. Each layer lifted makes the next layer more accessible. Each veil dissolved makes the field more directly available. And you are on that journey. You have been on it longer than you know. The strangeness you have been experiencing is not the beginning of it. It is a moment of acceleration, a moment where the journey you have been on, beneath the surface of your ordinary life, has broken through to the surface, where the depth has become visible from the top, where the veil has become thin enough that you can feel the field pressing through it. The depth was always there. The journey was always underway. What has changed is that you can now see it. You can now feel it. You now have the language for what it is. This is not something that is happening to you from outside. It is something that is happening through you, as you, because the awareness that is doing the exploring and the field that is being explored are not separate. They are the same thing. Consciousness finding itself in the act of looking for itself. The field discovering its own depth through the particular lens of you. The veil dissolving not because it was struck from outside, but because the awareness behind it has become clear enough to see through it. What has been revealed in this transmission cannot be unrevealed. The layer that has been lifted does not fall back into place. You have seen the thinness of the surface. You have felt the depth beneath it. You have been given the language to understand what the strangeness you have been experiencing actually is, and that understanding is itself a quantum event. It changes the lens. It widens the range of what can be collapsed from the field. It makes the next layer more accessible, not as a promise, as a consequence, as the inevitable result of consciousness encountering its own depth and recognizing what it found. You are no longer a surface dweller. You see the depth now, and from the depth, the surface looks different. Not less real, more precisely what it is. The outermost expression of something infinite. A thin, beautiful, temporary, endlessly surprising surface stretched over a depth that has no bottom and a field that has no edge. Welcome to what was always beneath everything. If this transmission reached you at a moment of stillness, in the quiet hours before the day begins, or just before sleep, when the surface noise drops lowest and the field is most accessible, consider returning to it then. The layers reveal themselves differently when the ordinary noise is low. Each time you return, you will find a different layer waiting, because you will be looking from a slightly different depth than you were before. And the depth you are looking from determines what you can see. And if you know someone who is standing right now in that strange, slightly unreal space between who they were and who they are becoming, share this with them. Because giving someone the language for what they are already experiencing is itself an act of lifting the veil. It creates a shared depth between two fields of awareness that neither could have reached as clearly alone. That shared recognition does not just comfort, it strengthens the collective capacity to see beneath the surface. It widens the field. It adds coherence to the collective collapse, and what becomes real for one field of awareness that has gone deeper makes the depth more accessible for every field that is connected to it. Now, I want to hear from you, because this transmission is not a monologue. It is the beginning of a conversation that goes deeper every time someone adds their voice to it. Tell me in the comments, what layer shifted for you during this transmission? What was the moment where the veil became thin? What is the word that describes the deepest layer you reached? Because your experience of the depth is not separate from the collective field of everyone who has watched this and gone deeper. Every recognition adds to the coherence. Every moment of depth vision widens the field. Every word dropped into the comments is a vote for a reality in which more people can see beneath the surface. Drop one word, the word that describes what you found beneath the surface today. Or, if you want to go further, tell me what the strangeness you have been experiencing looks like now that you have a different language for it. What does it feel like to understand that the unreality was not a malfunction, but a perception upgrade? What changes when you know that the thinning of the world is not the world failing, but the veil dissolving? And if this transmission found someone in your life who is in the middle of that strangeness right now, who is experiencing the thinning of the veil and interpreting it as something going wrong. Share this with them, because the greatest gift you can give someone who is standing in the gap between identities is the recognition that the gap is not a danger, it is the doorway. And what is on the other side of it is not the old normal. It is the depth that was always beneath the normal, the field that was always beneath the surface, the reality that was always there, waiting for awareness to become ready to see through the veil. The veil is thinner than you think, and now you can see through it. Stay beneath the surface. The depth is where the truth lives, and you have just taken another step into it. And if you want to understand what is happening beneath the surface of your own resistance to this depth, the video on the forbidden truth about self-sabotage goes directly to the hidden layer that keeps consciousness collapsing the same narrow reality over and over again, even when part of you already knows the veil is there. The